Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the LaRouche Organization's Manhattan Project meeting for Saturday, May 14th. Today's topic is the Higher Peace Movement, Thinking Our Way Out of World War III. And your moderator today is going to be Anastasia Battle, who will be taking over moderating duties after the beginning of our program. We're going to be beginning today with a video segment from Lyndon LaRouche from August 31st, 1996. And he is addressing a Schiller Institute conference, and he's just been asked the question, which we are going to play for you, about the nation of Lebanon. And he takes it as the occasion to have a sort of dialogue with the audience on matters which would seem to be anything but the question that he was asked. Now, the reason we want to show this in particular is that with the drive for total war with Russia and China on the part of what's sometimes called NATO or global Britain, people are baffled. Why is this really going on? And virtually no explanation seems to really make sense because everybody's trying to read what's going on from the standpoint of pairwise interactions between Ukraine and Russia, or Russia and the United States, or the NATO and Russia and the United States, and none of these finally satisfy analysis. And so what happens in this discussion is that Lyndon LaRouche tries to begin answering the question by completely changing the parameters of discussion. And in the segment that we're going to be concluding with, he will bring it to exactly the process that we're going to be engaged in today's symposium. And so we'll now play that video, and we'll turn this over to Anastasia as it concludes.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. Among the suffering nations is the Republic of Lebanon. I receive news from Lebanon. I know people in Lebanon and have followed for a number of years, sometimes with the help of the New Federalist, what's been done to Lebanon from outside of itself that has not been reported to the American people. The wider part, besides civil war being just a component part of the plan against Lebanon to ignite a civil war and then use that as an excuse for occupation. The occupation is getting quite cruel by Israel and the Syrian army, taking people to prisons and so on. I just want to ask you, what I do is I try to tell people, like I call radio talk shows, I say, if you knew the pattern used against Lebanon, you'd know something about the pattern used against other nations with variations, and it would help this country, because they say they don't care about Lebanon. I just want to ask you, maybe, do you think that's a wise idea, that if we did know the pattern used against Lebanon, we'd know the pattern? And what else could you offer me?
We have to understand what's going on here, because you can't explain it, which is what people in Lebanon and so forth try to do. You can explain it in terms of a nation state, when that is not the controlling feature. Nor is it just Syria, nor is it Israel. What you have, remember, go back to 1945, April 12th, 1945. And that's where all of these things begin to become clear, because if you don't put this in context, it isn't clear. Remember, the genius of Riemannian physical geometry is that you recognize that no event contains its own cause. No local phase space contains its own characteristics. You have to define what kind of physical space-time the universal space-time is, then you find the characteristic, then and only then can you understand. Now this may seem like mathematics or mathematical physics, but it happens to be everything is the same. That man's relationship to the universe is governed by certain laws. And there is no, in science, there is no division between social behavior, mathematical physical behavior, the cognitive processes of the human mind, and anything else. So we have to get to fundamentals in order to understand particulars. It is common practice to say, let's look at the particular, let's examine each particular question, try to answer those questions, then add the thing up and we'll get the world. On the contrary, especially now, you have to start from the world as a whole. And you have to understand history, and then you can understand what happened between 1945, April 12, 1945, and September 1946. Those are the two dates. If you do not understand those two dates, you cannot understand or explain anything of importance in any part of world history from that time on, including the case of Lebanon. What was the issue? Well, let's go back to the principle, and the question may come up, so I'll answer the principles applicable here, so I'll answer it here in this context. It has been long understood, as Riemann understood, that scientific knowledge is expressed by the increase of man's power over nature. Man increases his power per capita over nature and per square kilometer of the Earth's surface. And that is a test of whether a physical scientific principle is valid. That's the ultimate characteristic. This can be measured in terms of Gaussian curvature, Gaussian geodetics, if you get the proper mathematics. And you can say that the curvature is increased, or the curvature is altered. And this increase in man's power can be expressed in Gaussian geodetic terms as a change in curvature. So all of the events, for example, if you were living in a flat Earth, indefinitely extended, or an island floating out in a big space, big hollow bucket someplace, you'd have certain ways that the world would behave. But you don't live in a flat Earth floating out in a bucket in empty space. You live on a spheroid. And the characteristics of the spheroid Earth mean that everything that happens on the surface of the Earth has a different characteristic. Every event, from sneezing to coughing to everything else, all behaves differently because you're living on a spheroid surface rather than a flat something or other floating out there. Now that's the same principle. So in physics, we have an approximation of truth, which is the Riemannian test. Test the curvature of the physical space-time that tells you what the axioms are, what the hypothesis is, and you measure in those terms. You find an experiment which tells you whether your hypothesis corresponds to the curvature of physical space-time or not. But that's not enough. Because the question is, where does the hypothesis come from? The hypothesis comes from the mind. The test of the hypothesis is man's power in the universe, which is measured by man's ability to exist, which is measured in terms of numbers of persons on a limited planet, standard of living, demographics, all of these things. The rate of development of man's power per capita, per household, per square kilometer. This is the test. So the ultimate test of scientific knowledge is not mathematical, because discoveries come from outside mathematics. They come in experimental physics, but experimental physics is only an approximation of truth. The test of truth is the test of whether the human mind works or not. And therefore, the question is that what the human mind thinks is an increase in power, does this result in an increase in the life expectancy, the population, the power of the individual, and so forth, of mankind? That's what I've added to this process. So history is the history of scientific ideas in this sense. All politics must be judged by the yardstick of universal history. There are no different histories. The history of every part of the planet, every person, every locality is the same history. There are no separate histories. Different nations don't have different histories. They all have a participation in one history which is indivisible. The history of the human race. The history of the human species and its self-development. All right, now those of us who are good in the course of history have been struggling to bring about a condition of society in which this power of the human mind to transform man, to transform society, to increase man's life expectancy, the number of persons, the power over nature, the ability to conquer disease, all of these things. And the question of all statesmen and philosophers and people who meant good was, how can we do this? How can we make it better? How can we organize society so that society will tend to function in a better way? We call this constitutional principles. For example, we had constitutions in the history of mankind. The first constitution was in the Ionian city-states before the Persian conquest. And one of the great things Alexander the Great did, one of the greatest things that made him great, was he restored those constitutions when he kicked the Persians out of there. We had another great reform, the reform of Solon of Athens. This was a constitutional change. That certain society bound itself, we're talking today about this, society bound itself to say the will of the majority cannot defy certain principles. One judge says the society is wrong. I don't care if 90% of the society or 95%, as in Nazi Germany, vote for Hitler, they're still wrong. Everyone who votes for Judge Scalia is wrong. Everybody who voted for Tom Ridge is wrong. They committed a crime. They should have smelled that guy coming. His nose wasn't working. So to discover constitutional principles which have been proven, which say to us, we as human beings must not do this, we must do this, otherwise we will screw up, to use the modern vernacular. So we came upon the idea of the nation state. Why? What's the importance of the nation state? Do peoples make nations because of some blood nonsense? No, people are not dogs. Nationality in the sense of race or national race is crap. There are no human races. There's only one human race. Everyone who shares this cognitive potential is a member of the same race. Any other notion, application of race to mankind is idiocy, it's falsehood, it's nonsense, it's sin, it's crime, it's corruption. Man is the human mind, the cognitive power of the individual. There is no nation race. There is no secretion because I'm black, because I come from a certain part of the world, because I'm Russian or I'm German and so forth. This doesn't mean anything. These so-called nationalities are all a bunk anyway. All Indo-European languages have the same root. Right? And then we can find out that there are certain common features of Chinese and Indo-European languages of the same Sanskrit, despite their differences. So all this idea of race, we this people must have this, we this people must have this, is all nonsense. When you get to a political discussion, don't discuss somebody's race. Only if you've got a racist, then you've got to find out what you do with him. The guy who brings up the question of race, you've got to deal with him. But you don't allow race, you don't allow nationality in the sense of racial nationality, or we this people. It's all nonsense. It's disgusting bestiality. It's the swamp logic. But we do need what for? What do we need a nation for? We need a nation state because the individual is very mortal. How do you guarantee universal education? On the basis of individual choice? Would you have an educational system of competence on the basis of individual choice? Don't you need an institution to guarantee that every child shall not be a Yahoo? Do you want your kids living next to Yahoos? All right, then we better have some universal education around here. And it better be of a certain minimal quality. Do you want to say that the opportunity for doing good is it's up to your individual initiative? You don't make it, go die. Huh? Or do people have a right to the opportunity to find a niche in life? If you do some good, is your cops going to hover over what you did that was good in your life to protect it after you're dead? Or do you want the good you contribute protected by society to the benefit of future generations? So therefore you need government, governed by constitutional principles which will protect these things, because the individual is weak and frail and very mortal. But how should we have government? Well, we need government so the people can be citizens and participate in government, not be the property of some feudal landlord. Not be subjects, but be citizens, in the sense that they have as much right of access to the power of state as any other person. They are an equal standard. We don't allow any class society. It will allow function in our class society. So the participation of the individual society is important. Participation means what? It means discussion. We are creatures of ideas. The transmission and sharing of ideas is the ability to have self-government. And therefore, those of us who agree on certain principles can communicate with one another, can share ideas, can share a certain history, and govern ourselves accordingly. But then what do we require? Nations quarreling? No. The nation state actually, contrary to the rumor, reduced the state of warfare on this planet. The greatest wars, the most brutal things in history happened before the nation state. The nation state is the instrument of peace, not war.
Wow. I'm always pretty shocked whenever Lynn speaks of this. You know, we're taking different clips from different time periods, but it always feels like he's talking to us right now. Well, with that, I'd like to introduce Harley Schlanger, who's been a long-time collaborator of Lyndon LaRouche for, and I want to say 40 years. 40 years, Harley, something like that. And you were the
50.
50 years. Oh, excuse me. 50 years. My goodness. But it's, I mean, I'm sure that was an incredibly amazing time for you to be able to be Mr. LaRouche's spokesperson for such a long time, and all the various trouble that you two got into. So I'm sure we'll love to hear from you and what you have to say today. So I'll leave that up for you there.
Okay, well, thank you, Anastasia. One of the lessons that some of us learned from Lyndon LaRouche is that when the world is perched on the edge of nuclear war, it does no good to temporize, to hold back on making that point out of fear that either people won't believe you, or that if they do believe you, they'll be paralyzed with fear. So let me begin by stating what should be obvious to most people. If the Western world did not live in a bubble that was controlled and the ideas were shaped by literal psychotics in positions of government and institutions, and by the media committed to the lies and censorship as weapons of mass control, mass psychological warfare against the population. Here's where things stand right now. As a result of global NATO, global Britain, the control of the international bankers from the City of London and Wall Street, their game plan has put us on the verge of nuclear war. It may not seem from day to day as though that's the case, but that's just because of what I just identified. You're not being told the truth. The media lies, the politicians lie, and we lie to ourselves because we're afraid of the implications, as Mr. LaRouche was just saying, that it's up to us as citizens to intervene and not wait for a politician to step up and show some courage. Now, events of the last week pushed us closer toward crossing red lines that increase the danger of a full-fledged World War III. I'm going to focus on two specific aspects of that. The first is the NATO versus Russia policy and what happened in the last week on that. And the second one is the Western embrace of Nazis, particularly through looking at the bizarre case of the Disinformation Governance Board. Now, what I'm going to report to you is not exaggeration. It's truth. It's something that you should know and you could know. The question is, will you embrace the truth and take it out to other people? Now, to start on this question of the NATO Western war policy against Russia, one of the aspects of it in this last week was NATO expansion. The decision, which was announced yesterday, that the Finnish government, the government of Finland, and the government of Sweden intend to apply for NATO membership immediately. Now, in Finland in particular, this is extremely dangerous. Finland and Russia share an 800-mile border. Now, imagine what it would mean if Russia placed some of its hypersonic missiles with nuclear weapons on it on the Mexican border. You think it's bad what we have on the Mexican border now. What do you think it would mean if that happened? Remember John Kennedy's reaction in 1962 when the Soviets placed nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. He correctly responded by moving to a blockade and to threats to invade if the Soviets did not remove the missiles. And then they worked out a back-channel deal to take out US missiles out of Turkey in return for the Soviets removing missiles. That's how you do diplomacy. Well, if you bring Finland into NATO, that border, which borders Russia on the northwest of Russia, becomes a potential confrontation zone. You think about this, if you look at a map and look where St. Petersburg is, arguably the second most important city in Russia, it's directly confronted with NATO forces in Estonia from the southwest and then from Finland from the northwest. Finland would be moving from a neutral country, which it's been since the end of World War II, into part of the NATO bloc. Now, the argument is that, and this is what you hear from Stoltenberg, the war hawk who runs NATO. He said, well, this will increase the security of NATO's northern flank. But General Leonardo Tricarico, who's the former chief of staff of the Italian Air Force, said bringing Sweden and Finland into NATO does not lead to greater stability or security. And he said NATO should go back to respecting the rules, such as the rules that have governed the relationship between Finland and Russia since the end of World War II. Others, by the way, in Italy and military veterans are saying NATO should be dismantled, which is probably a more appropriate thing. Now, secondly, you have Estonia, which is a very small country, very small army, and yet they're going to be engaged in NATO military exercises, again, near the Russian border. This is going to take place, I think, starting later this week. Now, also on the NATO versus Russia front, we have more weapons coming in. Biden just tried to force through a $40 billion increase in weapons deliveries. Fortunately, for the moment at least, Senator Rand Paul, who at least on these war questions is one of the few actual patriots in the US Senate, he held it up by saying that he insists that there be an inspector general to look at what's happening to the weapons we're giving to Ukraine. But this is something that will probably go through in another week or so. Boris Johnson is going berserk. Johnson's whole strategy for an economic development package for the British is to do everything possible to build weapons and deliver them to Ukraine, where they'll either be destroyed by the Russians or sold to third parties by Ukrainian corrupt government officials. But that's not going to stop Johnson. So you have more weapons going in. You have more sanctions. The European Union just finished its 6th package of sanctions designed to cripple Russia. And yet we see from economists all over the world announcements that it's the West and the poor countries of the developing sector that are being hurt the most by the sanctions. The ruble has recovered. There are many people looking to the ruble as a possible replacement for the dollar. Meanwhile, we have hyperinflation in the West. We have the collapse of currencies. We have shortages. The sanction policy is, and it's not changing Russia's policy in Ukraine. Now, then you have another thing to keep an eye on, the escalation of the narrative that Russia is committing war crimes in Ukraine. This narrative is coming from the same people who somehow missed the war crimes committed by the US and NATO against Yugoslavia, against Libya, against Afghanistan, against Iraq, against Syria, where whole cities were destroyed. The story of Russia going in and destroying cities and doing mass killings, the figures don't bear it out. It is a war going on, that's true, and some civilians are being killed. But the question of war crimes being investigated by the Ukrainian special prosecutor, and there was a stunt pulled by the US this week. The new US ambassador at large for global criminal justice There's an oxymoron if you've ever heard one. Beth von Schack did a trip to Nuremberg to talk about beginning an investigation into Russian war crimes in Ukraine. So the NATO policy towards Russia is more war, string it out, keep the fighting going, and fight, as we've said from the beginning, to the last Ukrainian. Now, secondly, then, and this is something that should be being discussed, is the West embracing Nazis? It sure seems that way. And I'll give you the case, as I said, of the Nina Jankowicz, the bizarre, crazy lady who was just given the position as the so-called information or disinformation czar in the Department of Homeland Security. But keep in mind that President Putin said one of the key issues that caused him to launch the special military operations was the existence of Nazis in Ukraine's military and security and defense sector, and that the Nazis were the Nazi militias, including the well-known Azov battalion, now the Azov regiment, has been on the front lines of the Donbass, where 14,000 people have been killed, many of them, the majority of them, ethnic Russian civilians, which so far the UN, the OSCE, and other institutions empowered to investigate has not begun an investigation into these war crimes. Now, let me just mention that the denial of the existence of Nazis is one of the things that Jankowicz is an expert in, as I'll get to in a moment. But this denial has been called, the bringing her in and the setting up of this new disinformation agency has been described as Orwellian. Let me read a quote to you from Orwell's 1984, when Winston Smith, who's the protagonist in the novel, is talking about his job. His job was to rewrite history, go back into the archives of newspapers and change the newspaper articles to conform with present day policy. And he wrote on this, every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book has been rewritten. Every statue and street and building has been renamed. And that process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. Nothing exists except an endless presence in which the party is always right. Now, let's look at the events of last week to see if that's what we're facing today. First, let's look at what happened on May 9th, the traditional day in which the Eastern countries, Eastern Europe and Russia, celebrate the victory in Europe because the Nazi surrender occurred late on May 8th, early on May 9th. Well, this year at the annual Moscow Victory in Europe parade, which is where the Immortal Regiment marches through the streets of Moscow, that is, every family member who had a member that died during the Great War, the World War II, marches with pictures of their relatives in the street. It's a very moving ceremony. And there are almost always veterans from Europe and the United States who attend. This year, Americans did not attend. Visas were not extended to them, or they were not permitted to go by the US government. So it was as though the US government was trying to blot out the memory of the alliance, the World War II alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, which was the key to the defeat of Hitler and the Nazis. On that same day, the Russian ambassador to Poland was attacked as he was laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw. In Estonia, it was announced that they're going to tear down all statues that were erected to commemorate the Soviet army people who died in liberating Estonia. So there's the rewriting of history. Now, then we look at this Biden decision, the Biden administration decision to set up the Disinformation Governance Board and put this woman, Nina Jankowicz, in charge of it. Now, there's been a lot of focus on how crazy she is. There's a viral video of her doing a Mary Poppins tune about disinformation, in which what you see is a adolescent wannabe trying to show off her nightclub talents while talking about what should be a serious subject. And if you study her, you'll find that she is quite crazy. But there's a method to the craziness. Forget the fact that she's psychotic. She wrote a book called How to Lose the Information War, which is a diatribe against Putin, against Russia, which attributes things to Putin and Russia, which she herself is doing. She portrays herself as a disinformation expert. What she's an expert in is spreading disinformation. And I just wrote an article that will be in this coming issue of the Executive Intelligence Review, which details the story much more than I can go into right now. But just as an example, she was one of the people who, when the Hunter Biden laptop became an issue in 2016, and people were afraid this could turn the campaign against Biden, she was one of the people that came forward and said, this is a Trump campaign project. She later said it's an example of Russian disinformation. Now, it turns out she was completely wrong. So what does it mean when you assign someone the job of disinformation expert, when in at least that one case, she's been proven to be a spreader of disinformation? Well, she also tried to spread the story, going back to Christopher Steele, of the Alpha Bank, the Trump connection with Alpha Bank, which was disproven by the corrupt Robert Mueller. It's one of the things he got right. There are many other things that she was saying during the course of that campaign. But what's her background? This is where you begin to see what we're up against. She comes out of the Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama political team. In 2016, she was assigned through the National Democratic Institute, the NDI, to work with the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry in Kiev to counter Russian disinformation. Now remember, the coup in Ukraine, the color revolution, which was funded by the United States, the neocons, the State Department, George Soros, a number of other institutions, that occurred in February 2014. In March 2014, an organization was set up called Stop Fake. Stop Fake was set up by people who were defending the presence of neo-Nazis on the Maidan Square that was instrumental. Their presence was instrumental in the coup. In fact, the shooting and the violence that occurred in Maidan was coming largely from the Azov Battalion and other similar organizations coming out of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Now, the person who set up the Stop Fake was a man named Yevgeny Fedchenko, who was an open supporter of one of the most infamous of the neo-Nazi gangs, the C-14. Fedchenko set this up because the Russians were correctly saying that the Maidan operation was run by these neo-Nazi thugs. So this organization was set up to counter that, immediately got funding from the British Embassy in Ukraine. Its funding continued from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in Britain, which we know to be one of the government's leading disinformation centers. Money from the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the parent of the National Democratic Institute that Jankowicz worked for. By the way, the National Democratic Institute was run for some time by Madeleine Albright, who's another known disinformation expert who's also a professed killer. She said that it was worth it that 500,000 Iraqi children died from the sanctions in the mid-90s. It was worth it because it weakened the Saddam regime. That's who Albright is. Now, what in her book, Jankowicz writes about the work that she did to counter Russian narratives. And one of the things she talks about is the Nazis in Ukraine story. And she said, it's not true. It's Russian disinformation. And she continues to say that to this day. Now, how do you with a straight face, put forward the idea that you're going to have an agency to counter disinformation when its leader is spreading disinformation? We can go a step further than that. What else is she talking about? She's saying that free speech is a threat to our democracy. She said the First Amendment makes us reticent to censor. Well, that's the whole point. Why do you have a First Amendment? So that you don't allow censorship. But she is saying that you need a verified person. And very modestly, she says, like myself, to look at tweets and decide what the context is and what can be allowed. She's openly promoting the idea of censorship, as did her former boss, Barack Obama. In a speech in Stanford the week before Biden announced this setup of this new committee, Obama himself said he regrets that in 2016 he did not move quickly enough to counter the Russian disinformation that led to Trump's victory. So this is what we're dealing with. So when I said earlier, the West is embracing Nazis, what do we hear about? The courageous fighters in Ukraine who are standing up to the barbarous Russians. Who are they talking about? The Ukrainian army is being decimated. The Azov regiment and others are hiding behind civilians, as they were in the Azovstal plant in Mariupol, letting civilians get killed while they continued their rampages. And that's who's being defended by the new head of our Disinformation Governance Board. Now, these are hard truths. And as I mentioned at the beginning, LaRouche said you have to face these hard truths, not as matters of fact, but to get a sense of the geometry of the world in which you live. And I want to read you some quotes from an article that came out a couple of days ago from someone who believes, as LaRouche did, that it's only the hard truths that enable people to face the reality. This is from Caitlin Johnstone in an article published by Consortium News on May 10th, titled, "If the US Wanted Peace in Ukraine." And what she argues is it would have been very easy to avoid the special military operations of Russia. She writes, "Every major factor which led to Russia's decision to invade could have been nullified by the US government. A guarantee of no NATO membership for Ukraine could have been made." It still could be made, by the way. Then she said the weapon supplies could have been stopped, and Zelensky and his government could have received protection from the US military against the armed fascists who would repeat their violent acts of 2014 upon them. In other words, their threats to Zelensky, if he pursued the peace that he promised when he ran for president, where he was threatened that he would be hanging from a tree by one of these right sector Nazis, caused him out of fear to instead embrace the Nazis. Now, Johnstone goes on to say, it would have been wins all around. We wouldn't be staring down the barrel of nuclear Armageddon. Ukraine would have been spared the horrors of an insane proxy war. Western powers wouldn't be sending arms to literal Nazi factions. And the US would actually be protecting Ukrainian democracy instead of just pretending to. And here's her conclusion. But again, we're only indulging in fantasy here. Fighting Nazis, protecting democracy, and waging peace are not things the US empire actually does in real life. The US is the most tyrannical and murderous regime on earth by a truly massive margin, and it will happily risk the life of everyone on earth if it means securing planetary rule. But sometimes, she concludes, it's nice to imagine the kind of world we might be living in if we were not ruled by psychopaths. I think her designation of the Western leaders as psychopaths is accurate. And this should be a moment where those of us who are not psychopaths, those of us who believe, as LaRouche said, that there's one human race that must be defended from the highest level, that's our job right now, to remove these psychopaths from positions of power and instead establish a new security and financial architecture for the human race.
Thank you, Harley. Wow. Well, I want to pick up off of a number of things that you were discussing. I mean, I'm definitely generally very provoked. I mean, the kind of the breakthrough that I've been seeing here through some of the Germans. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, you know, it was not this open. You know, various reports that we've had in Germany, you know, people were very frustrated, or, you know, were freaking out about Russia. But there's been a growing resistance that's been happening, and you see this with this open letter, you know, that's come out to Schultz, asking to not send these weapons, and just going through very reasonably what the consequences are. And you know, this wasn't about being pro-Russia or anti-Russia. This was about, hey, this is going to be World War III. Don't you know that? And just from the various organizing, what our organizers have been getting, even just today, there were a number of people who were coming up to the table, you know, just saying, hey, no world war. And there was polarization. There was definitely polarization amongst different people. Germans, we've been getting a very good response from people who are German, but are from different countries, especially from Arabic nations, who are just noting at how, you know, disgusting the response to the war crisis right now has been. And I can't really believe that people are actually pushing it to this level. I mean, there's one example that was kind of funny. This woman comes up and she's very upset. She's, you know, hand waving and yelling and calling us names. And then at a certain point, I just asked her, well, how did you feel? Okay, you're upset about Ukraine. How do you feel about Afghanistan? She's like, well, what about Afghanistan? It's like, well, there's 43 million people on the verge of starvation right now. I mean, it's obviously a lot more than this. You know, it's growing. You know, how do you feel about that? And she flat out says, there aren't people starving in Afghanistan. And I was like, excuse me, yes, there are. And it's because of what the United States has done with these sanctions. And she had a total meltdown and blew up and said, all right, you're right, I'm wrong. And she left, but had to find an excuse because she didn't want to tolerate what that meant by accepting and just flat out denying what was going on in the rest of the world. But there are other people who have responded very well, who just walk up and it's, you know, they're a little bit scared, you know, just given what the media has been for a little while here. I mean, another interesting thing that I'll just do one more anecdote, just from a peace rally that happened just a few weeks ago. And I mean, it was pretty wild. But when our members were able to speak to the crowd, I mean, there was Ukrainians who were yelling across the street. It could have gotten very violent. There were more police officers than there were people at either one of these rallies. But when our members spoke, they went through what the conference, the Schiller Institute April 9th conference represented. They went through, you know, how we need to bring all nations together for new economic development, a new security architecture. And everybody just went quiet and listened. And then people were coming up afterwards, just thanking our members for what they did and saying what they said. So, I mean, this potential right now, I think if we can, you know, not get caught up on the tit for tat kind of situation. You know, people want to pick sides on everything, this divide and conquer kind of thing. But if we can rise people up to a higher principle, and fight on that level on what actually needs to happen, or else we will be facing thermonuclear war, then people can break out of that. And I want to encourage everybody who's on the program today to organize with the LaRouche organization, to join, what we're doing in the street, join the various campaigns that we've endorsed, which Jerry Rose, I'm really happy to have him on. He's been working on Diane Sayre's campaign over in New York State. And I want to give him the opportunity to be able to go through, what we've been doing there. I think this is going to be a huge inspiration for Americans to see that there's an optimistic fight to not just take what we've been seeing here, as what's actually going on in the population. So with that, I'll leave it for Jerry Rose.
Thank you, Anastasia. I think one of the editors of our Executive Intelligence Review made a very significant point, which really sums up the critical question. Because what he said, this is David Shaven, he said, leadership is now producing miracles. And he was in particular referencing the change, and Anastasia indicated it. You had 250,000 Germans sign a petition to not send heavy weapons to Ukraine, led by artists. It was a very significant, Colonel Black gave what I consider one of the most in-depth, moving discussions that I have heard on the implications of the insanity that has dominated the political class within the United States. That's over 300,000 views and going much further. And there are going to be some very important developments there. And if you have not heard his discussion, and it's a piece of thorough composition, really, this interview with Mike Billington, you really have to hear it. And what David was referencing in terms of leadership producing miracles is that Helga on Pakistani TV was faced with some opposition. People who said the Russians are this, and there's a pretty crazy faction inside Pakistan. And rather than, as Anastasia indicated, rather than go through a tit for tat, she just soared above it and said very simply, that which is unacceptable should not be accepted. You cannot put up with things that are unacceptable. And therefore, the question of peace, because as Harley has been pointing out very effectively, and he's getting 3,000, 4,000 people listening to him every morning, is that there is no negotiations or no intention of negotiations. And when Helga, rather than go through, she could overwhelm the person with the reality of the situation, she stated forcefully, you cannot accept this. And there are very real solutions. And that's the context for the miracle occurring around Diane Sayre's campaign in New York State. And it's really a fascinating miracle because of determined leadership. What was initially intended was that no other voice except the Democratic Party and the Republican Party would be heard. And New York State is a critical political entity, which Lyndon LaRouche was created the Manhattan Project, because he knew if you could shape politics in New York through a cultural, economic, and physical capability, then you could shape politics within the United States, and in that way shape world politics. So Lyndon LaRouche, I think about 15 years ago, created what was called the Manhattan Project. Now, the result of the Manhattan Project and the cumulative effect of the work, with a 2-year hiatus around the COVID problems, Diane Sayre made the decision, and this was a sovereign decision, when they tripled the necessity for, it went from 15,000 signatures, when the highest in the country, to 15,000 valid signatures with at least 15 or 13 to 15 districts of 500 or more. The most stringent requirements, such that we used to be 20, but they had to bring it down to 15. The day Cuomo left, he left us with a real legacy. They changed it from 15,000 to 45,000. They tripled the requirement, the most stringent in the country, with the largest legal staff in the country that challenges every single signature, with a corrupt court system. And they said, we're going to make it 45,000, making it impossible for any other voice to be heard. What Diane said to herself at the time is, we're going to do the 45,000. We are going to get the 45,000, which means something in the 70 to 80,000 range of signatures. And we are going to do what all considered impossible. And she never once doubted we could do it, ever. The effect of her decision, with a lot of backup from very talented people, is what we are seeing in the state of New York. And this was indicated in very clear terms yesterday on her symposium, as a new political leadership steeped in this battle to right a wrong, to reestablish politics in the state of New York and in the country, in what would seem to be something impossible, has created among younger people who are participating both as petitioners and witnesses, and not just younger people, but people in their 40s and 50s who recognize what's at stake here. We are now emerging with a new political leadership and a new political process within the United States, which we all knew had to happen. Some of us are who've been around for a long time with Lynn. What has happened to the political elites within the United States, not all, but the vast, vast majority in both parties, is somewhat stunning, even to us who've seen corruption for years. Nobody's ever seen corruption like this. Nobody. They are totally corrupt. That's their downfall, by the way. I did a lecture on a Thursday night called "Whom the Gods Would Destroy, They First Make Mad." This is not their strength. This is their weakness. The fact that they are so utterly corrupt and so unashamedly corrupt on everything, but the fact that it's leading us to war and depression simultaneously has created the context for a new political leadership to emerge. And we're getting this all over the place in the field. People want to join us. They see a fight. It's like, it reminded me of Lexington and Concord. Most people have the wrong idea of what happened at Lexington and Concord. Really wrong idea. It wasn't a bunch of farmers shooting from behind bushes and surprising the British. Oh, they surprised the British, all right. This was a highly trained cadre force who never disbanded after the French and Indian War. They drilled, they trained, they knew they would have to liberate the country from Britain. They knew it. George Washington was clear on it. In fact, the British didn't even want to fight the French and Indian War. But the cadre force that led that fight, they fought the British for 6 hours with tactics that the British could not believe. They shot behind boulders and other things, but it was all planned. And when they had to stand and deliver, they stand and deliver. And they almost captured the full British force, except for reinforcements that came. The cadre force trained by Lyndon LaRouche over this period has recruited, even under the COVID crisis, a number of young, quite courageous people who have now shown themselves in a way that I had hoped, but didn't know how it was going to turn out. You knew we had to have it. And now the kind of confidence, the kind of ability to do what would seem to be impossible has inspired a number of younger people, and not just younger people, I mean working class people. If you could hear the voices on our debriefing every night, you would be inspired like me. These are working class people, good Catholics in several cases, who said, one woman who's getting 100 signatures every time she goes out by herself, is going to people say, we just killed 14,000 babies in Afghanistan because of what they did. And if our government's going to do that to them, what do you think they're going to do to you? And people come up and say, and then if they give her guff, and they say, oh, well, I'm not going to vote. They say, a lot of people died for your right to vote, but that's your decision. That's what I always tell my kids. That's what I'm going to tell you. Right? And all sorts of other, I'm just giving you a case that I really appreciated. And this woman is in her 40s, 50s, almost got killed in a flood in Queens. A number of people who have been in the LaRouche movement a while have really shown incredible mettle. We have also, people have come forward, and we've launched 3 legal suits, which we don't have the money, everybody knows that, but we organized the money for it was $20,000 to organize 3 legal suits. We have also figured out and got the money because it had to be done. We've brought in a number of organizers since they opened up the petition capability. And this is why I say Lexington and Concord, any American citizen now can come into New York State, anyone, and petition. And this is Lexington and Concord. This is the reestablishment of a political process within the United States, which we all know, if mankind is to be saved, that must be done. So any of the people on this can show up. We'll figure out where to put you. We will figure out how to, you just need to be briefed once or twice, and we go out and fight. And Dennis Speed has made this point again and again. And I really, Dennis is on, but I'm going to say it anyway. When in the civil rights movement, and this is very akin to that, and I'm not talking about racial stuff. I'm talking about, as Lynn said, this isn't racial. This is a violation of every single citizen and the Constitution. So when you fight to right a wrong, and you fight effectively with courage, this inspires people. And we are getting feedback beyond belief of people who want to work with us, So the campaign is just beginning. And I want to say every night we discuss poetry, but not as an entertainment. But you have geniuses like Keats. In particular, I've chosen Keats as the kind of genius who understands the human mind, who understands, in one of the things that we were discussing 2 nights ago, in Keats's famous poem, I'm looking again into King Lear. He says, in the course of it, he says, let me take my inspiration, I'm paraphrasing it, let me take my inspiration not from the muses that are lyrical, but let me take my inspiration from the fight on the question of damnation and immortal clay. That fight that he describes mankind as immortal clay, right? Or the fight to impassioned clay, not immortal clay, impassioned clay versus damnation. So let me take my inspiration. Then he says, chief poet, he's referring to Shakespeare, chief poet. Then he says, ye clouds of Albion, the other great poets that have defined England. He said, ye clouds of Albion, lead us in an eternal theme. An eternal theme. Let me take my passion from that and let me inspire mankind in that way. Not, and clouds meaning a deeper, most people think clouds obscure. In Keats's poem, he talks about how the clouds give us a deep, eternal tone. So we are discussing on that level the kind of quality of leadership. And I think this is just an included aspect, but I think it becomes more alive in this context, in this fight. So, and David ends his discussion with anyone who says you can't change what is wrong, he calls it moral turpitude. Moral turpitude, a hollowing out of people. We must change this. We can change this, and we are in a real fight at this point, which is very inspiring. So that's what I have.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Well, I guess I forgot to mention that Jerry is also a Shakespearean scholar and has also worked with Lyndon LaRouche for, was it also 50 years?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah, and both Harley and Jerry have been very close friends with Helga Zepp-LaRouche as well. So thank you. I really enjoyed both your presentations. I just want to, one thing I was thinking about while you guys were going through this, in particular what you were talking about, Jerry, with the youth getting involved is, we just had this really wonderful youth presentation with Mrs. LaRouche, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, just this past week. And I mean, her youth from, I think it was 29 different countries, almost 200 people participating from all over the world. And we've had some discussions thereafter in using this youth movement to really not just disseminate the ideas that we're talking about here, but use it to really inspire the world to do what does seem like to be the impossible. Just in looking at some of the comments in the chat as things were going on, the thing I would say about, yes, World War is very scary. Things are very terrifying. But in a time of crisis like this also provides a huge opportunity, because people are able to make great changes in the way that they think. And maybe what seemed like a year ago, people would tell you, oh, you're a nut job, you're crazy, that's never going to happen. Oh, crap, it's happening. Now they're going to come to you for the answers. So we need to be those wonderful, crazy people that are willing to say the truth and put forward the ideas that are going to push for this new paradigm. We do have a few questions that have come in. I'll just read a couple from the chat. Let's see. Well, one question that's come in is someone who I believe is actually very new, who's come on asking you, Harley, and this can also go to Jerry too, if you want to jump in on this, but they say, quote, "He who pays the piper calls the tune." Now, who pays? This seems to be far larger than just a private Federal Reserve issue. Could you talk about who it is that is actually paying the piper?
Sure. Let me start. I just have one quick correction for Jerry, which actually goes into the theme he had of an expansion of our influence. I actually have an audience of between 30 and 40,000 a day for my daily update on the Facebook. And if people want to get it, they can go to the LaRouche Organization Facebook for Monday through Friday, a daily update. And it does show one other point, which is, while this is occurring in the US, there's a global realignment underway, which is a point that Mrs. LaRouche has been making, as whole sections of the world, the South, the former colonial nations, the former non-aligned nations, nations with the largest populations, such as India, China, Indonesia, are refusing to join NATO and the United States in the condemnation of Russia. And this has to do with the answer to the question of who pays the piper. The fight for degrading Russia, containing China, is being waged on behalf of the world's largest speculators, who are, by the way, also the world's largest debtors. The banks of the City of London and Wall Street, the hedge funds, the private equity funds, and so on. They have run a system into the ground, and they've done it through institutions like the Federal Reserve. But look, the Federal Reserve isn't the most powerful agency in the world. It's a front for the private banks. This is a point that people have to get. The private banks and financial institutions dictate the policies of the Federal Reserve because they own the Federal Reserve. They're the ones who sell the debt and market the debt based on the relationship they have with the Federal Reserve. And these are the institutions that are connected with the corporate cartels, the trusts that are known as the military-industrial complex. They're the ones calling the shots. They're terrified that in these circumstances, Russia and China will not submit to this new unipolar order, which is an order which says no nation can act for its own sovereign interests. We must have interests for the world as a whole, but they don't mean it for the world's population as a whole. They mean for a top-down dictatorship in which the central banks operate on behalf of the private financial institutions, including the grain cartels, including the raw material cartels, and so on. They're the ones who want these wars. And it's not simply because defense corporations make money from wars, although that's an element. But more importantly, this is how you control the world. When the decision was made to destroy Afghanistan, and then to destroy the government of Iraq, then to destroy the government of Libya and Ukraine, the targets in these were not just the people of those countries, but all the rest of the world, which was watching a shift underway between Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, and others. They were looking for a way out of the unipolar order, where they had to subordinate their government policies to the demands of the international banks. and they were too weak to stand up against the United States and NATO. And they were crushed. And the idea was, if you get out of line, this will happen to you. Well, now who's out of line? Russia and China will not give up their commitment to scientific and technological progress as the driver for improving the living conditions of their populations, and as in especially the case of China, those nations which join it in the Belt and Road Initiative, whose populations will be uplifted by the advances in science and technology connected to the Belt and Road Initiative. So when Russia and China made it clear that their view of the Green New Deal was not the same as the anti-science, anti-technology pushed by Prince Charles and Klaus Schwab and Mark Carney, they became the target. That's why Ukraine was used as a weapon against Russia. And I think that answers the question, who pays the piper? Well, the piper, the people playing the music, are the ones who have the most to lose by a world in which sovereign nation states act in collaboration for the development of each other. That's the principle of the Peace of Westphalia. That's what the Schiller Institute is fighting for. That's what Lyndon LaRouche dedicated his life to. And Jerry and I combined 100 years of our lives to. And that's the fight that any one of you can join. And let me tell you, when I say it's a fight, it's actually not a bad thing. It keeps you young. It makes you happy. Being able to engage with other people, not on the usual bullshit that goes on in conversations, on social media and so on, but on profound ideas like Jerry was discussing. Because then you find that everybody has what LaRouche used to call this desire for the sublime, to lift themselves out of the normal life into a recognizing themselves as having some eternal purpose, that's something that an immortal purpose that goes beyond the immediate day-to-day pleasures. And so that's the fight we're in, and more people are being recruited to that. And I think it's important to note that in the large numbers of people now watching my daily updates, we have many people from Africa, from Asia, joining the audiences, and also, by the way, from the United Kingdom and Australia. So it's a very fascinating process, but not big enough. Join us to make it bigger.
Excellent. Jerry, do you want to add anything to that? No. Okay. All right. Well, I got word that we have a question from, there he is, there's Jose. I'd like to bring Jose on, who also has been working on Diane's campaign. I've heard that he was actually part of her, some of her leadership, going out there doing some of this petitioning. And he's a very good friend of mine, so I'd like to have him on here and ask his question and give his report.
Okay, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm also running the back end of this show as we're proceeding along here. Anyway, yes, so my name is Jose Vega. I am a volunteer for the Sarah for Senate campaign, and I also do a lot of work with the LaRouche organization and the Schiller Institute. I wanted to give a report about New York City because that's where I do a lot of petitioning these days. Anastasia went through what it's like organizing in Germany, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about what it's like being in New York. New York right now, we are out every day, and I mainly focus in downstate New York. So, Manhattan and the Bronx have been the two boroughs that I've been doing a lot of work in. And, talking to people, and you see how easy it is to kind of peer through how thin what they believe the reality of the situation is, because they say, no, I'm a Democrat. I'm just going to vote Democrat. And you could either let them go and then, we got to get our signatures, or, and sometimes I just ask, okay, sure. I just want to make it clear, when you sign, this is just to get our candidate Diane Sarah on the ballot. I'm not asking you to support her or vote for her. And I had somebody come up to me and after I said that, and they said, well, you know, what is she going to do for me? You know, what is she, a conservative, a Republican or something? And I say, no, you know, one of the things she's going to do is address the reality of the situation and of the world. You know, I was in an area in Harlem. It's a very historic district, which now, you know, has been reduced to just pure depravity. And it's not what it once was. You know, Malcolm X used to have rallies there. And so there's a very famous intersection that's called Malcolm X Boulevard and Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, where you just see the worst things. You know, people are just slumped over because they're high on some kind of drug, or people are selling drugs blatantly on the corner and the police don't do anything. And so, I tell this lady, you know, she's going to address reality of looking at what's actually around you, and then looking at not just who's allowed it, but who's caused this to happen, which is, you know, one of the people is Chuck Schumer, you know, and it's Wall Street. You know, Wall Street and Chuck Schumer are the reasons why you have the situation that you have, not just in New York City or New York State or in the country, but also in the world. You know, and you have, you know, children starving in Afghanistan. So, you know, I'm doing all this in like 1 minute to convince this one person to sign this petition. And she's like, I don't know what my signature is going to do, but okay, fine. Right. So what is that? You know, that's also part of my question. You know, what is that? You know, when somebody signs my petition, they say, you know, all right, I don't know what one signature is going to do, but okay, fine. Now, my actual question, which is this, you know, Martin Luther King said that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean that people can just sit passively by and things will work themselves out? You know, to what extent is it completely up to humanity? And to what extent is natural law involved, I guess, to explain a principle of a higher order? At what point does that also get involved? So that's my report and my question, and I pose it to anybody on here who would like to talk and respond.
Yeah, sure. That's why I was so struck by what Dave Shaven identified. It is a question of leadership creating miracles. Because these are not miracles in terms of a defiance of the law of the universe. These are what would seem to be miracles based upon what people call sense certainty. Aren't they powerful? Don't they have the money? Don't they have the power to do what they want to do? Well, the truth is they don't. The truth is their belief that they have that power is precisely what will bring them down. What you need people, you know, you get unique geniuses like Lyndon LaRouche, absolutely unique, who make fundamental scientific discoveries and change the course of history. So, but why does it work? Because the human species has an innate quality of what you would call being human. People do know the difference between good and evil. There are nuances, these are not just opinions. We have an innate sense of what is beautiful. And certainly Keats, in his famous Ode to a Grecian Urn, references beauty is truth, truth is beauty. In other words, a quality of mind in every single human being on the planet, which defines us as an immortal species, which defines us as a cognitive species like no other species. That quality of mind, and that's a whole other subject, which I won't get into, that quality of mind, which descends from the heaven, that each individual has what they call imago Dei. Every single person on this planet has that potential. And therefore, when a leadership is capable of evoking that potential, evoking that idea of humanity in another person, or at least fighting for what this person knows to be for them, at a certain point, when the enemy comes for you, you will not be alone. As we saw with the single candles in Leipzig, that grew to hundreds of candles, to grew to millions of candles, that tore down the Berlin Wall. As we saw in the American Revolution, and as we're seeing now, we are touching off a deep spark within the United States in a context, as Harley has pointed out, of the four powers. Three of the four are there. The fourth, this is a pitched battle. And as that's what, in my interpretation of the arc of history, is long, but it bends toward justice because humans are designed that way. We're not what Locke and the British call tabula rasa. We're not empty vessels that are shaped by who's ever got power. So that's one way I would think about it.
Great. Yeah, just one thing I would I want to mention is there's a few initiatives that the Schiller Institute has had. One, I mean, I mentioned the conference, which you can watch at the schillerinstitute.com. We also have it posted on the TLO website right on the homepage. But the other thing is that there's a paired petition that goes with that to create a new security and development architecture. And actually, I'm going to post the link in the chat right now so everybody can take the opportunity to go and sign that at some point. Read it and sign it and distribute it. We've got about 4,400 signatures right now. We want to grow this. We should get, oh my God, I mean, why don't we come up with a number right now? Why don't we double it, in the next week or two? I mean, let's really get this out and get all sorts of, political figures, artists, scientists, talk show hosts. There are other Harleys out there. I mean, Harley, we love you, but there are other people out there that, can also distribute this material. We really have to come together as a movement and collaborate to make this breakthrough right now. I can't see that this is the greatest opportunity that we've ever had as an organization for our ideas to come to fruition. There's just a huge amount of openness. So anyway, I want to encourage everybody to work with us again to continue to organize. But I'll come back to some more questions here. Actually, unless Jose had any follow-up, he can feel free to jump in.
No, I don't think I had any follow-up. I did just want to say though, and Keats, I just wanted to kind of append this to what Jerry was talking about with Keats, is that Keats did his whole career from the age of 19 to 25. And I think that's pretty significant. So, yeah, also, and if Harley had any reactions to what I had reported also, or to that question too, if not, otherwise that's it.
No, I'll stick with what Jerry said. I think Jerry did a good job answering that one.
Okay. Well, we got a question that's come in from Erica, and it's a pretty decent question. She says, the $60 billion we are giving for war in Ukraine could have not fed everyone in Afghanistan, but would have stabilized relations among Iran, Pakistan, India, China, and the United States, and Russia, as well as other nations. It's also 1/3 of all the money we have sent to all of the Southern American and Central American nations in the past 70 years. That's well over 20 nations that, if stabilized, would stabilize immigration as well. And it's not just money, it's the pathway to true security. What's the best way to get people to understand this, that this is what we should be doing, rather than what we are about to do with these resources? Erica, does this question go to either one of you?
Well, let me start with a couple of points. It's obvious, completely obvious, that money should not be going to war, because war is destructive. And there's nothing behind this war right now except an attack on a potential new paradigm. But that brings me to a deeper point, because it's not just a question of the money. Because a lot of people would say, well, but if we had $60 billion and we were using it for foreign aid, why should we do that? Shouldn't countries take care of themselves? This is where we have to get back to the idea of the four powers and the four laws, economic laws of Lyndon LaRouche. Because money is not the issue. The issue is scientific and technological progress. It's human productivity. It's the transformation of what Vernadsky called the noosphere, the development of the noosphere, the ability of the human mind to transform the physical reality in which we live. And that's not a question of money per se, that's a question of credit. But credit represents a commitment of a nation and of the people of a nation for that kind of transformation, not just for themselves, but for the world. Now, this was the idea that at the end of World War II was there in the four freedoms and the policies of Franklin Roosevelt in laying out the post-war period, which was sabotaged by the British Empire, in particular Churchill and the stranglehold he had over Harry Truman. And we've been fighting since the end of the Second World War between this idea of a British Empire, which boils everything down to money. That's the whole neoliberal idea that, well, if you make enough money, then you can give some charity. Charity is not the issue. The issue is, what do you think is the basis of human existence? What is important about a human life? And the Hamiltonian credit policy was based on Hamilton's appreciation for what happened to him in his own life. He was poor. He grew up in a poor family, but he had an opportunity to do something, which was to create a nation and create a national economic process which benefited every person in that nation, and actually was the basis for the American system, which then spread throughout the world. Now, the obvious answer, Erica, is, look, we shouldn't be using money for wars. We should be using the credit capability we have for economic development. Development is the way you have peace. But this has to be understood as a credit policy. And I think that was one of the main part of Lyndon's genius, was his discussion of the difference between money and credit. And I know Jerry may have something to say on that also.
Yeah, I think Harley just hit it right on the head. And I just want to reference the first thing that Lynn said to that woman in the answer to Lebanon. He said April 12th, 1945 was what the day that Franklin Roosevelt died. What was planned for the end of the war, in which none of this would have occurred, was the end of colonial rule. I wrote a docudrama. I have the actors, but I haven't been able to get the filming right. But anyway, and Franklin Roosevelt says to his own son, Elliot, and this is in first person, he said, Elliot, if we don't end colonial rule, your son, who was 5 years old at the time, will be fighting war. And he said, no colonial, this is his brawl with both, Churchill right from the beginning, but also de Gaulle. De Gaulle changed, by the way. Now, what was actually planned? It was on the books at Bretton Woods. What was it? What was it really? Russia was to be, along with the Security Council, Russia and China, which Roosevelt insisted upon, be part of the Security Council with the United States as the bulwark against a return to colonial rule. And he had worked with Stalin, and both the Communist Party of China and the Kuomintang agreed to a development policy in which Stalin was going to buy American machine tools, which we had scrapped because of Harry Truman and the Cold War, because we had worked out a credit arrangement where Russia would become an industrial nation and would work with the United States to develop the world. That was what was negotiated at before and at Bretton Woods. Massive in credits for rail and development in China. It was the 1919 policy of Sun Yat-sen. Both were agreed to. And the development of China, the development of Russia as a community of nations would have, and the development of every single nation in the world as a credit system, as Harley so aptly told you, this is critical. This is critical. Not money, credit, right? All of that was there. And this day Roosevelt died, Wall Street started the Cold War. They started it. And the rest was the unfolding of where we are today. Now, there are aspects of Bretton Woods that function very well, and in 1971, Wall Street got rid of it. There was a stable currency. The dollar was used as a credit system for Western Europe, but many nations were left out. So I think what Harley said is true. This credit system, which China, Russia, a number of other nations now, India in a different way, have been inspired by Lyndon LaRouche and Helga to delve deeply into these policies. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. But I appreciate what Harley said. It's critical to differentiate between money and credit. That's a completely different. And credit can be generated based upon an intention. It's not money versus money. It's an intention and a concrete intention to do certain things.
If I could just add one point to that quickly. The other thing to differentiate between is liquidity and solvency. Because if you look at the world today with the quantitative easing and the Federal Reserve policy, you have banks that are overflowing with liquidity. You have corporations that are getting liquidity from the banks to pay the interest on their debts, which they're not earning enough money to pay. But that doesn't make the system solvent. In fact, it makes it more debt-ridden. The increase in liquidity from the trillions of dollars of bailout money adds to the total debt. And that's, in some cases, Lyndon LaRouche and his triple curve showed the relationship between monetary aggregates and financial aggregates. But as they go skyrocketing up, if the physical production is starved for lack of credit, you reach a point, a hyperbolic moment in which the whole system collapses. And that's what we're seeing. So I think this credit versus money and solvency versus liquidity are important distinctions which are unknown to the imbeciles like Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell and the Bank of England types, the ones who are making policy, who basically are running psychological warfare against you when they talk about how, well, actually, we're doing pretty well because a lot of people are making a lot of money.
Yeah, actually, if people really want to delve into a lot of this. Mr. LaRouche wrote a book called So You Wish to Learn About Economics, which we actually did a pretty wonderful introduction to LaRouche, which goes through a number of the concepts that he had in this textbook, but also just his breakthroughs and what our movement has really been about. It's a series, an 8-part series that you can find on the LaRouche organization website. It's actually just right on the homepage there. So if you really want to get a sense, since I see there's a lot of newer people in the chat and newer people just being introduced to who we are, that would be a good place for you to check out what we've been up to. But I'll come back to the questions here. We have another question from the chat from somebody named Jerry. He says, "Hi, Harley. Can you give us a quick timeline as to when you think the pieces will be in place for World War III to break out?" You know, this is a happy question.
There is no timeline because we're not going to let it happen. I mean, the essential point is that it could happen by accident at any moment. You know, I mentioned the upcoming military exercises of NATO in Estonia. There are planes, fighter planes, and some of which include nuclear weapons, that are involved in exercises in which they approach the Russian border. And when you think about what I said about the Finland-Russia border, or even Ukraine-Russia border, you're talking about 5 to 7 minutes where the Russian military leaders are going to have to decide whether these planes are part of an exercise or are they actually crossing over with nuclear weapons. And so World War III could happen by accident and go to nuclear war instantly at any moment now. The question then is, what would be the rollback from that? And this is where the starting point has to be that Zelensky has to be told that he will not be given weapons, he will not be supported for aggressive actions against Russia, and that there have to be mutual security guarantees given to both Ukraine and the Russians, which is what Putin said back in December of 2021, that what he was looking for was security guarantees for Russia, that Ukraine would not be used as a starting point or a launching ground for attacks on Russia. Had that been done at the time, and subsequent to that afterwards, Zelensky said on several occasions, well, he would accept the idea of Ukraine not going into NATO. What? Why wasn't he allowed to do that? And that's where you see the role of the Anglo-American establishment pulling the strings. So, you know, we could be in a World War III any moment now, but it's also possible to get away from that. But it's going to take a lot of work, and that's going to have to come from people who are listening to this program. And also, it is occurring, as we talked about earlier, military leaders from people like Colonel Richard Black, who's, if you haven't seen it, you should go to the Schiller Institute and watch his interview. But he's not the only one. Douglas McGregor, a Colonel Danny Davis, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. American military veterans are speaking out against World War III. We see it from French and Italian military officials and former government officials. So, you know, the potential is there to transform the situation, but as we were saying, you want to bend the arc of history, you have to grab it and make it a personal cause.
Thank you. Let's see. Well, there was one other, it was kind of a combo comment question that's come in, which is, you hear it actually quite a bit in the field or just people talking about it, because they're trying to communicate how to stop World War III. And, you know, you get so many people are just like, oh, that'll never happen. That's, you know, they just don't want to think about it. So he's saying, you know, I see the value in the concept of mutually assured destruction, talking about this as a deterrent for World War III, but I don't see it as the answer to the concept of war. And I would like to know how to express the concept to actually overcome war. So I'm going to pose that question, and either one of you can take that up.
Well, let me take it up in a slightly different way. If one studies history, most of history is some oligarchical power trying to overcome some other oligarchical power. And as early as the Greeks, there was a concept which is developed in Aeschylus, and particularly his Prometheus trilogy, but we only have one of them, in which Zeus, who is the oligarch, wants to wipe out mankind. He said, there's problems with it. They don't please me anymore. He wants to wipe it out. And one of the gods, Hephaestus, or really Prometheus, not Hephaestus, Prometheus steals fire. And fire, by the way, is a fascinating concept in and of itself, because all animals are terrified of fire, except man. There's not one animal that is not terrified of fire but man. And in the Aeschylus's Prometheus, this fire, this spark, creates the sciences, the arts, the ability to discover. It opens up man to becoming an immortal species. So that our actual nature is of a different type than the beasts that war over scarce resources. But you have the bestial nature of not all rulers, but throughout history. It wasn't until you had, in the modern time, the creation of the Italian Renaissance. And out of the Italian Renaissance occurred this idea of man that dominated the culture. And two nations, one, France, and as a follow-on, Henry VII's England, but particularly Louis XI's France, had broken with the oligarchical principle. France, in particular, Louis XI, was a genius. And what he did was he pitted one oligarch against another because he didn't have the power to take over. So he pitted one against the other until he was able to break the power of these warring oligarchs over France and create among the people of France a standing army for defensive purposes against oligarchs. And the rate of growth and flourishing of the sciences and the arts in Louis XI's France spun off into Henry VII's England. It's a very complicated, but remember, they had 100 years of war in England. It was called the War of the Roses. And Henry VII was able to break, and I know the whole story, but I'm not going to go through it, was able to break the power of these warring oligarchs who had slaughtered England, slaughtered themselves, slaughtered everybody. In fact, brought on the Black Death by this slaughter. But because of the unique capacity of the scientific discoveries that spun off the Italian Renaissance, created the first two nation states that broke the power of the oligarchs and imposed peace for the first time in human history. They had the power to defend their people against the depredations of these oligarchs. And then later, the American Revolution was the first time in history that the nation state was established on the principles of the Constitution and the general welfare for all mankind, and particularly within the United States. So it has been a political fight. And had Franklin Roosevelt lived, we would have won that fight once and for all. That was his intention. That's why I did the docudrama. He was the most powerful president the United States has ever had. He broke their back. He knew how to do it, and he had the people to do it with. And he convinced Russia and convinced China to work with him to end this system of colonial rule, of depredation of man by man. So we have a great history. And we are now in that fight again with Harley's leadership, with Helga's leadership, with Dennis, with a number of other people who are coming onto the scene. There's too many to mention, to reestablish that within the United States. And that fight is to break the back of the power of Wall Street in London. Russia's with us. China's with us. The majority of the developing sector is with it, but we must win it in the United States. That's how you end war. No other way.
Anastasia, let me just add one thing to that, because if you take what Jerry just discussed as the historical prologue, the end of mutual and assured destruction could have occurred with Lyndon LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative, which was a policy of mutual and assured survival. And this is one of the reasons that LaRouche was vilified so aggressively and thrown in prison, because what he demonstrated is that this principle of the nation state, the physical principle of the nation state, committed to scientific and technological progress, could remove mankind from a condition of thermonuclear blackmail, where the only way to avoid war was to threaten the destruction of every person on the planet. And unfortunately, we're still there. Ultimately, the danger of a war is that once, the idea that there could be a limited nuclear war is crazy. It's the delusional psychosis. Because once a nuclear weapon is used, the ability to stop retaliation goes out the window. But with Lynn's idea of using new physical principles to develop a capability to render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, more importantly, gives way to the other side of that. That is the new physical principles, and with electron beams, plasma physics, and so on, offer you the means by which you can end the problem of limited resources, of limited energy. And so that's the solution ultimately to overcome mutual and assured destruction. And that's what we have to fight for, in the development of a new global security architecture and financial architecture, committing nations to that kind of fight, led by the four powers, because the rest of the world, outside of the British and outside of the British flunkies that seem to populate the European Union, at least the officials, we have the potential of the majority of mankind to move in that direction.
Actually, what's really funny is that, especially with where you were closing, I just got a request for a comment on a news item, which is kind of exciting. Says that plants grown in Apollo lunar regolith present stress-associated transcriptomes that inform prospects for lunar exploration. And just a little quote here. It says, "The return of humans to the moon during the NASA Artemis Program 1 has elevated scientific interest in the lunar environment and its impact on terrestrial biology. Since the return to the moon is envisioned as a dedicated long-term commitment to lunar exploration, questions of the lunar environment impact on biology and biological systems have become a significant part of the lunar exploration agenda. Plants have long been envisioned as part of lunar habitats and exploration environments. However, until the current study, the interactions between lunar materials and terrestrial biology were unaddressed in the era of modern molecular biology. And there had yet to be any equipments where plants were actually grown in the true lunar regolith. Understanding the impact of sustained exposure of terrestrial biology to lunar regolith and determining the efficiency of lunar regolith as a viable in situ resource is important to the concept of returning to the moon for long durations. And they ask, could you please comment on this? This is very exciting.
I'm
either
for
one.
it. No, I can just say one thing that was interesting. I had the opportunity to address my son's second grade class here in Potsdam, Germany, on space and the dream of space exploration. And it was extremely interesting to see the reactions, because in Germany, the green environmental nonsense is so thick. And yet with young people, while one person did say, isn't it dangerous to try and do things like that? The children were so excited by the idea of establishing colonies on the moon, industrial capabilities on the moon, and then Mars and beyond, that it was really an inspiration to me. You know, it's a case where, as the teacher, you get inspired by the students. And I think this is why the thing that my comment to that longer report is we have to fight to make sure that we do follow through with the Artemis project of returning to the moon and beyond. That this is, on LaRouche's 4 laws, the 4th law is investment in research and development at the frontiers of sciences, which includes nuclear fusion and especially space exploration. So that's my comment.
Okay. Well, we're going to be coming up on time pretty soon, but I wanted to say a couple of things, and then I'll give you guys the opportunity for closing. Is we have some wonderful publications. The LaRouche movement loves literature. We love to read. We think it's a good thing, not a bad thing. In fact, we should read a lot more. And the LaRouche organization, if you become a new member to our organization, you can get the Executive Intelligence Review magazine for $25 for 1 month, or 2 months for $50, along with the Daily Alert, which is like a online newspaper that comes directly to your email. So if you think the media is complete crap, you're right. You should get on our stuff. It's so much better than anything else that you're going to find out there. And I'll actually post a link in the chat here for everybody if you click on that link, it'll take you to a sign-up page where you can get a LaRouche organization membership and get that Executive Intelligence Review magazine. It's very important that we do that right now. And it also supports what we do. It finances our organization, so you get 2 for 1. The other thing I want to bring up is just a lot of our discussion today really touched on, the various organizing we're doing. How do we educate ourselves? How do we educate other people? How do we organize other people so they can educate other people? We address that. Maybe some folks may not know this, but I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Leonora magazine of the Schiller Institute. And you can also become a member of the Schiller Institute and get that magazine delivered to your email. And the idea is that this is a cultural, it's an art, science, and statecraft magazine oriented towards recruiting youth, especially. It's not only for youth, but it is oriented towards being polemical and getting under the skin. And that's what our next issue is really going to be aimed at, of what are the ideas that we have to evoke right now to make the breakthrough politically. That means scientific ideas, artistic ideas, and really organizing ourselves to come to this higher level. So I would encourage everybody to get both of these magazines if you can spare it. But we're really at a breaking point in history, and we want to give you as much ammo as you can get to go out there and organize the world. So with that, I want to give Harley and Jerry the opportunity to close. And how about we go in order? Harley, how about you start?
All right, I want to come back to the question of this Disinformation Governance Board, because there was a very sharp exchange between Senator Rand Paul and Mayorkas, who's the head of the Department of Homeland Security. And after this discussion, Rand Paul said, we shouldn't have this agency. What's the point? And if you think about it, some people would say, well, the issue here is we really need more information. That's how you beat disinformation. And they say, instead of censorship, we need more information. No, it's not more information that's needed. It's more dialogue, more debate, more discussion. And discussion with the kind of profound ideas that Jerry was bringing up when it comes to the question of Shakespeare and Schiller, what you're talking about, Anastasia, with the Leonora publication, the faculty of the mind, the human mind, has to be enriched constantly. And what Lyndon LaRouche always emphasized is the way you educate yourself and educate young people is by reenacting in their own minds the great discoveries made by generations that went before us. That's how you defeat disinformation. When people develop the critical faculties, what the Greeks sometimes called character. And by that, what they meant is the ability to do a kind of analysis that enables you to free your imagination. So you're not trapped in the binary kind of discussions where it's either or. Lynn used to always say, when you're given two choices, always take the third. And I think the solution to something like the disinformation problem, it's a problem because the oligarchy is using disinformation to create false dichotomies. And for example, the question of money or credit. And so the real fight is for reestablishing a classical cultural curriculum that is available to every child in every country on the planet. And that's what I'd like to say in closing.
Okay, go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, just to hit the initial theme, because out of this crisis, as what occurred, it doesn't necessarily occur. It doesn't, we've had dark ages. We've had situations where the oligarchy destroyed themselves and destroyed everybody during the dark ages. We've had several dark ages, and dark ages we not even know of before this, before the modern, what we call modern history. But you have, because of the effect of Lyndon LaRouche, who he has an autobiography, people should read it. As Anastasia said, some of his most critical discoveries are developed in depth in the, So You Wish to Know All About Economics, but a unique quality of genius, which has in it both a humility, but a fearlessness, like a Joan of Arc. Great humbleness, but she was fearless because she knew what the truth was. And it was always said, the truth will set you free. And this quality of genius of Lynn and then Helga has created the potential under these crisis conditions. And it's moving very rapidly in Russia and China. They're rethinking what economics is. China already did it. Russia's coming on board. Other nations are. So this quality of genius and courage of genius, as we see emerging out of this fight in New York, should give us great hope and great encouragement. And I think people should consider how to get involved in the real way for this fight. We have to win it. There's no question about it. We have to win it. And I think we can.
Well, thank you, both you, Harley and Jerry, for joining us. It's wonderful to have 100 years combined of Lyndon LaRouche activism. Hey, and if you add mine, it's another 15. So we got 115 going on here.
Actually, we're talking about 140 years between the two of us. But anyway.
Oh, no. So,
but who's counting?
It was really delightful.
Don't tell, whatever you do, don't tell Harley.
I think it's too late. No, it's been really wonderful having you guys on. And thank you, everybody who participated in the chat, who have been sending questions in. Please definitely become a member of the LaRouche organization. Remember to like, share, and subscribe this video. Subscribe to our channel and get out our other videos. Also check out the Schiller Institute. The Schiller Institute YouTube channel has tons of interviews, different political interventions that are being waged, class series, all sorts of stuff that I think you would enjoy as well. And catch us again here next week for another wonderful live presentation with everyone here. So with that, I'll say everybody have a good evening, and we'll talk soon.